The sound came first, not the impact, what preceded it. The specific frequency of something very large moving through atmosphere at an angle it was not designed to survive, the air itself compressing and heating around a body that had no business being alive, and was alive anyway through some combination of biology and pure, cold refusal. A streak across the Nevada sky at 3 in the morning that the automated weather monitoring systems logged as a meteor event? And that was not a meteor event. The crater was 12 feet deep and 20 across. The sand at its edges had fused into glass from the heat of entry. For 4 seconds, nothing moved inside it. Then a hand came through the surface. One hand. The left. It punched through the fused crust at the crater's center, and the fingers spread and found purchase in the sand, beneath, and pulled. Conquest came upright in stages that had nothing to do with ease and everything to do with mechanics, the specific, sequential problem-solving of a body assessing what it had available and using it. The right arm ended at the shoulder. The wound had sealed in the way Viltrumite biology sealed catastrophic damage. Not cleanly, not comfortably, but completely, the tissue closing over itself in the cold of space to prevent the bleed-out that would have killed anything else. The seal was raw. The shoulder was a ruin. He did not look at it. He stood, the Nevada basin stretched in every direction, flat, dark, the kind of emptiness that read differently under alien eyes than under human ones. Not peaceful, just empty. The kind of terrain that had never been asked to support anything significant and showed it in the quality of its silence. The moon was already down, set sometime in the hours before he'd entered the atmosphere. The stars were the wrong configuration. He had been to enough planets to read stellar positioning as fluently as a sailor reads coastline. And this configuration told him, third planet, Sol system, the one that had been generating complications for the Empire for longer than it was worth. He had not aimed for it. He had simply fallen toward the nearest gravity source before his consciousness gave out, and this is where the gravity had taken him. He took stock. One arm. Compromised internal structure, 2 ribs at minimum, possibly 3, the kind of fractures that a healthy Viltrumite healed across days, but that a damaged one managed across weeks. Blood on his face from the atmospheric entry, dried dark in the cold air. His armor had not survived the re-entry in any meaningful sense. It covered him the way ruins cover a foundation. Technically present, structurally irrelevant. He looked up at the sky, not with hope, with the specific analytical attention of someone determining what they had to work with. The stars were clear. The air was breathable, thin by his preference but functional. Gravity was manageable. The planet was inhabited, which meant resources, which meant options. Thragg believed he would die in space. The thought arrived flat and cold and complete. Not as grief, not as rage. Those were emotions that required energy he was currently allocating elsewhere. It arrived as a data point. Thragg had made a calculation, and the calculation was wrong. And the wrongness of that calculation was the only thing in Conquest's current situation that constituted an advantage. An enemy who believes you are dead does not prepare for you. An enemy who does not prepare is an enemy who can be approached. He made a fist with his remaining hand. He held it. Then he released it and turned in a slow circle, reading the terrain, and settled on a direction, and began to walk. The thermal imaging flag appeared on the GDA operations console at 3:17 a.m. Pacific time. A junior analyst caught it on the second sweep. She'd almost categorized it as geological, which is what the system's automated first pass had done, but the energy signature on closer review was wrong for geological. Too concentrated, too localized. The decay pattern was consistent with biological heat generation rather than mineral dissipation. She flagged it. Her supervisor, who had been doing this long enough to have a file on what Viltrumite energy signatures looked like, looked at the flag and picked up a secure line. Cecil Stedman answered on the second ring. He listened. He asked 3 questions. Confirmed coordinates, current movement. She checked. Yes, the signature was ambulatory, moving northeast at approximately 6 miles per hour. And whether there was any additional signal traffic in the area. There wasn't. Get Nolan, Cecil said. No ground team until he's assessed it. Tell him I said it might be one of his. He hung up and sat for a moment in the dark of his home office, looking at nothing in particular, running math that had no comfortable answer at the end of it. Then he got up and started getting dressed. Nolan reached the crater 40 minutes before the first GDA vehicle. He had that advantage. No roads required, no traffic to navigate, just the direct line from his current location to the coordinates he'd been given. He had been back on Earth for 4 months, long enough for Cecil to have his number, and short enough that neither of them had fully settled into what that arrangement meant. He came in low to avoid radar and landed at the crater's edge, and looked down at the impact site, and then looked at the figure standing 60 yards away, facing away from him, apparently watching the eastern horizon with the particular quality of attention that had nothing to do with the sunrise and everything to do with something Nolan couldn't immediately identify. He dropped into the crater, walked across it, came up on the other side. He stopped 10 feet away. Conquest turned to look at him, one eye, ancient scars catching the pre-dawn light in ridges and valleys, the right shoulder ending in that sealed, raw terminus that Nolan's gaze went to for exactly 1 second before he brought it back to Conquest's face, because looking at the wound any longer than that would be an acknowledgement Conquest wouldn't want. They looked at each other. 2,000 years of shared context occupied the space between them without needing to be articulated. Not friendship, something older and stranger than friendship. The specific familiarity of beings who have existed in the same world for long enough to have been, at various points, colleagues, adversaries, and everything in the complicated range between those two things. They had fought beside each other. They had once fought against each other, briefly, over a tactical disagreement on a campaign whose name Nolan could no longer remember. They had spent centuries moving through the same empire without being the same kind of thing. "You look terrible," Nolan said. A beat. Conquest's expression did not change. His jaw moved slightly. Not speech, just the adjustment of something settling. "Thragg," he said. Something shifted in Nolan's face. Not surprise. The particular quality of a fear that has been sitting in a drawer for a long time and has just been confirmed as justified. "How long?" he said. Not a question, a request for a specific number. "Before the Armada moves." Conquest's voice was rough from the re-entry, from the cold of space, from whatever the last several hours had done to his respiratory system. He spoke through it without adjusting his delivery. "Months, maybe less." Nolan looked at him for another moment. Then he reached down, an offered hand palm up at Conquest's shoulder height. Conquest looked at the hand. He did not take it. He turned, and using nothing but the mechanics of a body that had been built for exactly this kind of damage, stood fully upright under his own authority. He swayed once, a single degree to the left, and corrected it. But he didn't step away from Nolan. He allowed the proximity, stood close enough that if he went down, Nolan was there, which was not a thing he would have permitted 12 hours ago, and was not a thing he was now going to acknowledge permitting. Nolan lowered his hand. They stood together in the Nevada dark and waited for the GDA vehicles whose headlights were now visible at the horizon. Cecil stepped out of the lead vehicle with the particular body language of a man who has already completed his fear response internally and is now operating purely on function. He assessed Conquest the way he assessed everything, with the rapid, comprehensive attention of someone who understands that the quality of his next decision depends entirely on the quality of his current observation. One arm. Catastrophic but contained damage. Standing, fully alert, by every indicator available. The single functioning eye was tracking Cecil with the kind of attention that Cecil recognized from his files on Viltrumite behavioral profiles. Not hostility, assessment. He was being measured. Cecil walked toward him, not quickly. Nothing about his approach performed confidence, because performed confidence was something you needed when you didn't have the real thing, and Cecil had long since stopped needing the performance. He walked toward what was functionally the most dangerous surviving entity in the Nevada basin, and stopped 6 feet away and looked up slightly, because Conquest's height made looking up a requirement, and said, "Mr. Conquest, I'm Cecil Stedman, GDA. I understand there may be a mutual interest conversation we could have." Conquest looked at him. The look lasted 3 full seconds, which in Conquest's economy of expression was approximately the equivalent of a lengthy evaluation. "Your planet is going to be invaded," Conquest said. "Your people are going to be harvested or enslaved. I know how many are coming, what their order of march is, and where Thragg plans to make planetfall." Cecil held the look. "And what do you want in exchange for that information?" "Your doctor," Conquest said. "Your machine shop, and the half-breed." They moved him underground within the hour, not because he needed assistance moving, which Cecil had rapidly determined was not a service Conquest would accept, but because the facility access required navigation that Conquest didn't have. He walked through the desert to the entry point under his own power, which the GDA security team gave appropriate berth, and descended into the facility with the unhurried attention of someone cataloging an environment they intend to understand completely. The conference room they brought him to was concrete and fluorescent, and smelled of machine oil and filtered air. Conquest sat at the table. The chair took his weight without comment, and for the next 2 hours he spoke. He drew on the table's surface with a stylus someone produced. Formation diagrams, approach vectors, the specific tactical philosophy of a Viltrumite invasion at scale, broken down into phases and priorities and the particular vulnerabilities that each phase created. He spoke with the economy of someone who has no interest in making information impressive, only in making it useful. His voice was flat and precise, and did not editorialize. At one point, a medic positioned herself at his right shoulder and reached toward the sealed wound with a scanner. Conquest's remaining hand came up without looking. Not fast, not threatening, just present, and wrapped around the medic's wrist and moved it 6 inches to the side, precisely, without applying pressure. He continued his briefing without interrupting himself. The medic retreated and made a note and tried again later with better positioning. When the briefing concluded, the analysts and tactical staff filtered out to begin acting on what they'd received, and Cecil stayed, and Nolan stayed. And Conquest sat at the empty table with the diagrams still visible on its surface, and looked at the drawings he'd made. The medical team returned with more authority this time, and this round he allowed them to begin working on the shoulder, not because he'd changed his assessment of the necessity, but because the information had been delivered, and the requirement to perform functionality had temporarily reduced. He sat with their instruments doing what instruments did, and looked at the wall. Eventually the room was quiet except for the medic's work, and the distant hum of the facility's systems. Conquest lay back on the table when they were finished, not at anyone's instruction, just following the direction of a body that had used everything available to it, and had arrived at the end of what was available. His remaining hand pressed flat to the surface beside him. His chest rose and fell with a control that was not peace, but was the last available form of management. He was unconscious in under a minute, not from relief, not from safety, simply because his body had presented him with a bill for the last 18 hours, and he had run out of the currency to refuse it. On the table's surface, the invasion diagrams stayed visible in the fluorescent light. 73 data points for how the Empire took worlds. All of it in Conquest's handwriting. All of it now pointed in the opposite direction from the hand that had drawn it. 3 weeks underground changed a person. Conquest was not a person by most operational definitions Cecil used, but 3 weeks underground changed him anyway. Not in character, not in disposition, but in the specific way that confinement changes anything built for open engagement. He had been doing calisthenics in his assigned room since day 4. Single-arm work, adapted with the particular inventiveness of someone who refuses to allow a missing limb to constitute a limitation rather than a variable. The medical staff had found him on day 6, standing on one hand in the center of the room, running some internal count that he did not explain and they did not ask about. He endured the intelligence briefings. Cecil fed him the way a confined predator endures a feeding slot, present, technically cooperative, visibly aware of the dimensions of the space he was in. He answered questions. He asked better ones. He never asked about the arm. On day 19, Cecil came to him with the specifications. The file was printed. Cecil preferred physical documents for sensitive materials, a habit from decades of operating in environments where screens could be monitored. He set it on the table between them and stepped back and waited. Conquest picked it up with his remaining hand. He read it with the complete, unhurried attention he gave to tactical materials, which is to say, he read it once, slowly, and then set it down and did not need to read it again. The arm was not elegant. The specifications didn't pretend it was. Reinforced servo architecture at the shoulder joint, titanium alloy skeletal structure, impact-rated surface plating that Cecil's engineers had designed to Viltrumite combat parameters, which had required significant back calculation from the impact data GDA had collected during Conquest's 2 previous engagements with Mark. The grip strength was rated above what a standard human prosthetic would offer by a factor that required its own classification level. The elbow joint had been overbuilt to the point of redundancy because the engineers had looked at the stress modeling and then added 40%. At the base of the wrist, recessed into the housing, was a component the specification sheet listed under a heading that Cecil had not tried to soften with euphemistic language. It said, Termination override, remote activation, single use. Conquest read this line. He read the lines around it. He set the document down. Smart, he said. I'd have done the same. Cecil had prepared 3 responses to potential reactions to the kill switch disclosure. He had not prepared a response to this one. That's pragmatic of you, he said. Don't mistake it for trust. Conquest's eye moved from the document to Cecil, with the specific quality of attention that had been making the GDA staff uncomfortable for 3 weeks. The attention of something that was cataloging rather than engaging. I have no use for your leverage. When I've finished with Thragg, you can do what you like with it. Cecil held the look for a moment. Then he picked up the document, folded it once, and put it in his jacket pocket. The arm will be ready in 4 days. 3, Conquest said, the engineers. Tell them 3, he looked at the wall. I've been waiting long enough. It took 3 days and 14 hours. Cecil did not tell Conquest about the 14 hours. The fitting happened in the medical bay on level 3, under fluorescent lighting that made everyone present look slightly unwell. The GDA engineer assigned to the installation was a compact woman named Dr. Reyes, who had spent 11 years working on prosthetic systems for GDA field operatives, and who had never worked on anything remotely like this, and who had decided, after reviewing the specifications, that the correct professional response to that fact was to simply apply her expertise and not think too hard about what happened if the patient decided he didn't like her work. Conquest sat on the installation table and looked straight ahead while she worked. The shoulder interface had required surgical preparation, a session he had submitted to with the same flat cooperation he gave everything he'd been asked to do in the facility. Not consent, exactly. More like the decision that resistance to this particular process had no strategic value. When Dr. Reyes announced the primary connections were complete and the activation sequence could begin, Conquest said nothing. He looked at the arm. Then he moved it. The fingers extended individually, index, middle, ring, small, thumb, in sequence, slowly. He was not testing the range. He was mapping the proprioceptive feedback, the specific quality of the signals the arm sent back up through the shoulder interface, calibrating the gap between intention and response. He picked up a steel equipment case from beside the table. Not quickly. He simply reached for it, closed the prosthetic hand around its frame, and applied pressure. The case compressed with the sound of structural failure, the walls buckling inward, the handle folding, the latching mechanisms giving way at the stress points. He held the compressed shape for a moment, examining it. He set it down. He flexed the hand twice more. Open, closed, open. And then looked at Dr. Reyes. He did not thank her, but he stood from the table without being told the session was complete, which she later described to a colleague as the closest thing to acknowledgement she was going to get, and which she had decided was enough. Mark arrived at the facility with Nolan on a Tuesday that felt, in the GDA's underground lighting, indistinguishable from any other day. He walked through the access corridor with his hands at his sides, and his shoulders set in the specific configuration of someone who was very angry and working very hard to carry that anger as something other than what it was. Nolan had told him what he needed to know, not everything. Nolan had made choices about what he needed to know meant, in the way parents make those choices, and Mark had recognized the editing, and had decided not to push on it, because the alternative was a conversation he didn't have the capacity for right now. He knew Conquest was here. He knew why he knew what was being proposed. He had fought Conquest twice in his memory. The first time had nearly been the last time. The second time, he believed it had been the last time for Conquest. He'd been wrong. Thragg had reached the same conclusion independently, and had, in his way, tried to confirm it, had taken what remained of Conquest at the end of that fight and thrown it into space and called it resolved. The miscalculation had put Conquest in a Nevada crater and Mark in a GDA briefing room being told to walk through a door. The room they brought him to was the training floor on level 4, still being outfitted when Mark arrived, the blast-resistant wall panels only partially installed on the north side, cables running along the ceiling and exposed conduit. Conquest was already there. Standing in the center of the floor, facing the door as if he had been standing in that specific position for exactly the amount of time required for Mark to arrive and find him already present. Mark stopped inside the doorway. Conquest looked at him, not the way you look at someone you're being introduced to, the way you look at a piece of equipment that has been described to you and that you are now comparing against the description. He walked a slow circle. Mark tracked him, not turning to follow, just moving his eyes, keeping Conquest in his peripheral vision and his face forward. His jaw was set, his breathing was controlled. He was doing everything correctly for someone standing next to a live explosive, which is what Conquest was. And the fact that he was doing it correctly was the first data point. Conquest completed the circle. He stopped. "You're carrying your weight wrong," he said. "Your dominant side is overcompensated. You've been brawling, not fighting." That wasn't an answer, Mark said. His voice was even. He was working for it. It was. "The answer is, I get a weapon. You are not a warrior yet. What I do to you will change that. When Thragg arrives, you may be useful." He looked at Mark with a single functioning eye. Flat, measuring, absent of anything that resembled personal investment. "That's all you are to me. Don't complicate it." Mark held the look. Behind him, Nolan stood in the doorway, and Nolan's expression was the expression of someone watching their child navigate something they cannot navigate for them, and understanding, with some difficulty, that this is correct. "Fine," Mark said. 2 letters. Flat, carrying beneath them a stubbornness that had nothing to do with bravado, and everything to do with the specific quality of a person who has been told what they are and has internally declined the categorization without making it an argument. Conquest registered this. He did not show that he registered it. He turned away. "Tomorrow," he said. 0600. Don't be late." "I won't wait." Cecil met with Conquest alone that evening. Level 5, his operational command, which he'd cleared of staff for the duration of the conversation. He sat across the table from Conquest with a legal pad and a pen he never used, and the particular posture of a man who has been doing this long enough to know that the best position in a negotiation with something you cannot control is honest pragmatism. "There are limits," Cecil said. "You don't break him. You don't put him in medical for more than 48 hours. You don't target his head repeatedly." Conquest looked at him. "The limits of war don't care about your list. The limits of my patience do." Something moved in Conquest's expression. Not a smile, nothing that organized. A shadow of acknowledgement that the statement had landed with a precision he hadn't anticipated. "The boy's already been broken once," he said. "By me. He's still functional. Perhaps your concern is misplaced. That was in combat. This is supposed to be training. There's a difference?" Cecil wrote nothing on the legal pad. He looked at Conquest for a long moment, trying to determine whether what he'd just heard was a philosophical position or a threat. He reached no definitive conclusion. He added a note to his file instead, the file on Conquest that was now 47 pages and growing, and moved to the next item. "The monitoring technology in the arm," Cecil said. "My engineers have remote access." "I read the specifications," Conquest said. "I told you I have no objection. Have this conversation with someone who requires it." Cecil put down the pen. "I'm going to be honest with you. I don't trust you. I'm not going to trust you. What I'm doing here is extracting maximum value from a volatile asset for as long as the asset remains operative. That's the entirety of my position." Conquest looked at him. And I wanted you to know that, so we're not pretending." A pause. Conquest's prosthetic hand rested on the table surface. He flexed it once, the fingers curling and extending, in what appeared to be a habitual movement rather than a deliberate one. "You're more rational than most of the things I've dealt with on this planet," he said. It was not delivered as a compliment. It was delivered as an observation. "We understand each other." He stood, which concluded the meeting by his own authority rather than Cecil's, and walked toward the door. Cecil watched him go. He sat for a moment after the door closed, looking at the 47-page file on his tablet, and then at the empty chair across from him, and then he opened the file to page 48 and began writing. Nolan found Conquest later that night on Level 6. He had not been told about Level 6. He had found it the way he found everything he wasn't told about, by paying attention to the things people didn't say, and the doors they walked past without looking at. The evidence vault was dark when he entered it. Conquest had not turned on the lights. He was standing in the ambient glow of the vault's emergency strips, looking at a row of cataloged artifacts behind a transparent barrier. The artifacts were labeled "Objects from Prior Encounters," "Alien Incursion Remnants," "Recovered Technology," items whose provenance the GDA documentation described in the careful, neutral language of institutional record-keeping that did not editorialize about what the objects represented or what had happened to the civilizations that produced them. Conquest was looking at a carved stone cylinder approximately 8 inches long, behind the barrier on the third shelf. The GDA label identified it as ceremonial and probable function, recovered from the site of a Viltrumite pacification campaign 12 years prior. The planet of origin was listed. Conquest would have known the campaign. He would have known the planet. Nolan entered and stood beside him. He did not ask what Conquest was looking at. "We were both part of that," Nolan said. "I know what I was part of." Conquest did not look at him. "Then why fight for this planet?" A silence that had weight to it. Not absence of thought, but the specific quality of a response being considered by someone who does not give unconsidered responses. "I'm not fighting for it," Conquest said. "I'm fighting against him. There's a difference." "Is there?" No answer. Conquest reached out, his prosthetic hand, the new one, the one that moved slightly wrong, and touched the transparent barrier above the carved cylinder. Not quite reaching the object, just the barrier between them. He held the contact for a moment, then he let his hand drop. "Train the boy well, Nolan." His voice had the quality of something that had been decided rather than something being said. "Or what I do to him in that room will be wasted." He walked past Nolan toward the exit. His footsteps on the concrete were even, unhurried, carrying no particular weight. Nolan stayed in the vault. He looked at the carved cylinder behind the barrier, at the label, at the planet of origin, at the careful neutral language of the GDA's documentation. He stayed for a long time. Mark stepped through the training floor door at 0559. He had not slept well. The bunk in his assigned room was adequate, and the facility was quiet, and neither of those things had mattered because his nervous system had spent most of the night doing the kind of accounting that happens when you are about to willingly enter a room with something that nearly killed you. He had lain on his back in the dark and run through the first fight with Conquest in his memory. Not to prepare, not to strategize, just because his brain kept going there the way a tongue goes to a sore tooth. He stepped through the door and Conquest hit him. No preamble, no acknowledgement of his presence. Mark was 2 steps into the room when the strike caught him across the upper chest. Not full force, something below that, but below full force for anything else Mark had encountered. The impact lifted him off the floor and carried him through the partially installed wall panel on the north side and into the concrete behind it and through approximately 14 inches of that before the momentum resolved. He was in a new room, a storage space, shelving units, equipment cases, a cloud of concrete dust that hadn't finished falling. He pulled himself out of the wall. His chest was reporting something significant. His ears were ringing from the impact. He walked back through the hole he'd made and found Conquest standing in the same position, watching. "Wrong," Conquest said. Mark worked his jaw. There was blood in his mouth from where a tooth had caught his cheek. "What was wrong about it?" "I got up." "You got up slow. An enemy doesn't wait for you to get up slow." He hit Mark again. The first 3 days established the pedagogical framework through accumulated consequence rather than explanation. Conquest taught the way geological processes teach, through the relentless application of force, until the thing being shaped either breaks or learns the shape it needs to become. He identified 3 failures in Mark's combat architecture. He did not announce them. He simply designed every drill and every exchange around the specific pressure point of each failure, until the failure became undeniable to both of them. The first, Mark telegraphed. His face changed before his body moved. Some micro-expression, a tightening around the eyes, a shift in the set of his mouth, preceded his strikes by a fraction of a second that was, in a fight between beings at this level, the difference between landing and missing. Conquest countered every telegraphed strike for 2 full days without explaining how. On the 3rd day he stopped a drill mid-sequence. "Close your eyes," he said. Mark did. "Throw the combination we ran this morning." Mark threw it. Into air, no target. "Open them." Mark opened them. "Your face doesn't move when you can't see me." Conquest walked a circuit around him. "The tell isn't physical. It's anticipatory. You're reading the reaction before you've committed the action. You want to know if it's going to work before you decide to try." He stopped in front of Mark. "It won't work. Not because the technique is wrong, because you're negotiating with yourself before the fight is over." Mark said nothing. He processed this. "Again," Conquest said, and the drill resumed. The second failure was the power calibration, the deeply conditioned habit of pulling force near human-scale engagement. Mark had spent years learning to be in the world without destroying it, and the training had calcified into an instinctive restraint that engaged before conscious decision. Against a Viltrumite, it was not restraint. It was a deficit. Conquest addressed this without subtlety. He stood still and told Mark to hit him. Mark hit him. Conquest looked at his own chest where the impact had landed, then back at Mark. Again, he said. Actually, this time, Mark hit him again. Harder. Again. On the fourth repetition, something in Mark's suppression chain gave way, and the strike landed with a crack that echoed off the concrete walls and moved Conquest back one step. One step. Conquest looked at the foot he'd moved, then at Mark. He said nothing. He moved to the next drill. But he didn't reset to his original position. He stayed the one step back, which Mark understood without being told was the acknowledgement. The third failure was the one Conquest spent the most time on, and said the least about directly. It was day 6 when it became unavoidable. Conquest had worked Mark into the floor across 3 hours, a session that had started with technique work and had escalated in the way all their sessions escalated, through the progressive logic of Conquest adding difficulty until the ceiling of Mark's current capability became visible. By the end of the 3rd hour, Mark had 3 fractured ribs in early stages of Viltrumite healing, a dislocated shoulder that had been relocated by the medical team and was operating under protest, and a split in the skin above his left eye that had stopped bleeding but hadn't closed. He had been put down 8 times. He had gotten up 8 times. Conquest worked him into a standing clinch. Both of them upright, Conquest's arm controlling Mark's, the technical position from which the natural conclusion was a choke. He applied the hold. Mark's hands came up and went to work, trying the established counters and sequence, the ones they'd drilled, then the modifications, then the improvised adjustments that happened when the established counters didn't work. None of them worked. The hold tightened. "Tell me why you didn't use your elbow on my jaw when you had the angle," Conquest said. Mark's voice was strained. "Because I was trying to break the hold, not lie. You had the angle. The instinct was there. You chose not to." "Yeah, because killing you wasn't necessary to get free. And if I hadn't let go, then I would have escalated." Conquest's grip did not change. "I didn't let go. You're still losing oxygen. Escalate now." A beat. In that beat, Mark ran the calculation. Not the moral one. He'd already had that argument with himself somewhere in the last 6 days. But the spatial and physical one. The angle was there. It had been there for approximately 40 seconds. He'd passed on it twice. He drove his elbow into Conquest's jaw. Full force. No negotiation at the moment of commitment. No last-instant reduction. The complete, uncalibrated strike that the angle required. Conquest's head snapped to the left. The impact produced a sound that was specific and significant. The hold released. Mark stepped back, breathing hard. His hands came up to a defensive position from reflex. Conquest rolled his jaw. Something in the joint clicked twice, the sound of a structure being checked for damage. His head came back to center. He looked at Mark. Something moved in his expression. Not satisfaction. That was too human a word for it. More like the register of a piece of data arriving in the correct column after a long time in the wrong one. "You can hit," he said. "The problem is you wait for permission you're not going to get." Mark's breathing was returning to something like normal. He wiped the blood from his eye with the back of his hand. "I don't need permission. I need it to be necessary." Conquest looked at him. Elaborate. "I'm not fighting to end things fastest." Mark held the look. "I'm fighting to end them right." The training floor was quiet around them. The exposed conduit in the ceiling hummed faintly. Somewhere in the facility's deeper levels, a ventilation system cycled through its pressure adjustment. Conquest said nothing. He turned away and walked to the equipment rack on the south wall, and stood there for a moment with his back to the room. Mark watched him. There was nothing in Conquest's posture that gave anything away. The set of his shoulders was what it always was, the prosthetic arm hanging at his side at the same angle it always hung. But he didn't call the next drill. He stood at the rack for 4 seconds longer than any transition between exercises had ever taken. Then, "Again," he said. And the session resumed. Week 2. The session that became the chapter's defining moment arrived without announcement, the way the worst things always do. 6 hours. An unbroken session with 1 3-minute interval for water, not a concession to Mark's biology, Conquest informed him, but to the hydration requirements of optimal tissue repair function during active training load. The distinction mattered to Conquest in a way that was entirely consistent and entirely characteristic. By hour 4, Mark's Viltrumite healing was running behind the damage rate. Bones that had fractured in the session's second hour were in the process of knitting and being stressed again before completion. His left leg was operating at reduced capacity from a throw in hour 3 that had landed him on concrete at an angle his knee hadn't accommodated. He was fighting differently than he had at the session's start. The economy of movement Conquest had been drilling into him was now the economy of someone managing a significant deficit, and the two looked identical from the outside, which was itself a lesson he didn't have the bandwidth to appreciate in the moment. At the 6-hour mark, Conquest stepped back and looked at him. "Stay down," he said. "There's no shame in reaching a limit." Mark was sitting against the wall, both hands on the floor beside him, palms flat. His chest was rising and falling in the controlled rhythm he'd taught himself across the last 2 weeks. Not the automatic rhythm of recovery, but the deliberate rhythm of someone choosing to recover rather than just waiting for it to happen. He looked up, blood on his teeth. His expression was not defiant. Defiance would have required energy for display, and display was a luxury. What his expression held was quieter and simpler than defiance. The specific quality of a person who has heard a statement and processed it and determined that it does not apply. "Sure there is," he said. He put his hand on the floor. He pushed. His leg reported immediately and significantly. He kept pushing. He got to one knee. His arms shook, not from failure, from the specific vibration of a structure being asked to do something it was technically capable of and currently underpowered for. He got the foot under him. He stood. It took 4 tries. The third try almost resolved into a second collapse. He caught the wall with his forearm and used it, which was not technically standing, and which he stopped doing as soon as he had enough under him not to need it. He was upright. Conquest had not moved during the process. He was standing in the center of the floor, with his weight distributed evenly and his expression doing the thing it always did, which was nothing that could be easily categorized. He looked at Mark standing against the wall, breathing, functional, upright. He turned away. He walked to the far end of the training floor and stood with his back to Mark. He was not moving toward the equipment. He was not setting up the next drill. He was standing in the corner of a concrete room at the end of a 6-hour session and looking at the wall. 40 seconds passed. He did not turn around when he said, "Same time tomorrow." In the monitoring room on level 5, Nolan and Cecil were watching the session feed on a split screen, the current floor camera, the biometric data running in a secondary window. Nolan watched Conquest's corner of the screen. "He's not breaking him," Nolan said. "No," Cecil said. "He's not. He keeps changing the exercise right before it would require him to admit the boy is doing it correctly." Cecil was quiet for a moment. On the screen, Conquest remained in his corner. Mark remained against his wall. Neither of them had moved. "I noticed that too," Cecil said. Neither of them brought it up to Conquest. Nolan understood why. Cecil understood why. Some things closed themselves off the moment you named them, and what was happening in that training floor was still in the process of becoming something, and naming it before it finished becoming would be the kind of mistake that neither of them could afford. On the screen, Mark finally pushed off the wall and walked toward the exit. As he passed the center of the floor, he glanced at Conquest's back. He didn't say anything. He left. Conquest stayed in his corner for another 2 minutes. Then he began, alone running the drill sequence from the session's second hour. He ran it until he'd worked out what was bothering him about it. He never quite got there. Cecil had negotiated the perimeter access with the specific, careful language of a man arranging a compromise with something he could not compel. 2 hours per night. Supervised, which meant a GDA security detail at a distance that was close enough to observe and far enough to be tactically irrelevant if Conquest decided he no longer wanted to be observed. Cecil had included this detail in the arrangement because he believed in honest accounting. If Conquest wanted to leave, a 4-person security detail was not the mechanism that would prevent it. The mechanism was the kill switch in the arm, and they both knew it, and pretending otherwise would have been the kind of fiction that eroded the operational relationship. Conquest used the access every night. He went to the same position, a slight elevation in the terrain 40 meters from the facility's northern exit, a natural shelf of rock that provided unobstructed sightlines to the east and the sky above. He stood there, sometimes for the full 2 hours, sometimes less. The security detail stayed at their distance and filed reports that described his activity as stationary observation and offered no further analysis because there was no further analysis available. What he was doing, in the language that the security detail didn't have and wouldn't have known to reach for, he was watching an alien planet breathe. The first night that produced something he couldn't immediately discard, he was watching emergency services respond to a structure fire 3 miles east, visible from his elevation as a column of orange light. The radio traffic from Cecil's monitoring system audible through the earpiece he'd accepted because Cecil had framed it as a security requirement, and it happened to provide ambient intelligence. The building was a 4-story residential structure. The fire had started on the 2nd floor and moved fast. By the time the first units arrived, the upper floors were compromised, and there were confirmed occupants who hadn't made it to the exterior. He watched the firefighters go in. Not all of them. The incident commander was doing triage, reading the structural situation, making determinations about which entries were viable and which were recoveries rather than rescues. But some of them went into a building that was actively failing, carrying equipment and training and the specific professional certainty that they had calculated the risk and accepted it, and that the calculation included the genuine possibility of not coming back out. They were not strong. By any measurement Conquest had ever applied to the question of strength, they were not strong. They were small and combustion vulnerable and relying on tools to protect them from an environment that would kill them in minutes without those tools. The building didn't fall. The occupants came out. Every one of them. Conquest stood on the rock shelf and watched the aftermath. The units cycling out, the equipment being cleared, the incident commander doing the final walkthrough. He watched until the column of orange had reduced to smoke, and the smoke was thinning, and there was nothing left to watch except the ordinary quiet of the Nevada basin resuming around a building that had survived. He didn't file the observation anywhere. He didn't reach a conclusion. He went back inside when his 2 hours were done and ran his nighttime conditioning and slept. But the next night, he went back to the same position and watched the same direction. The GDA soldiers ran their combat drills in the Eastern Yard on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, which Conquest had established from 3 weeks of ambient sound from the facility's upper levels. On a Thursday, in the 3rd week of training, his session with Mark ended early. Not by design, but because Mark had taken a hit to his right arm that the medical team assessed as requiring monitored healing before the next session in Conquest, had, without ceremony, told him to go and closed down the floor. He went to the perimeter access without waiting for evening clearance. The security lead, a pragmatic woman named Kowalski who had been on the Conquest detail since week 1, and who had developed the particular professional ease of someone who has decided that the entity she's monitoring has settled into a predictable pattern in that. The predictable pattern is manageable, processed the early access request, and approved it and fell into the standard trailing position. From the rock shelf, the Eastern Yard was visible. The drill was a close-quarters response exercise. 4-person teams, simulated hostile contact at varied distances, the kind of repetition-heavy work that built reaction patterns below the level of conscious decision. They were getting things wrong. He could see it from this distance without difficulty. The footwork on the approach, the communication timing between team members, the tendency of the 3rd position in each formation to overcommit on the initial contact and leave the team's rear exposure unmanaged. They ran the drill. They got it wrong. The supervising instructor flagged the error. They ran it again. They got it less wrong. They ran it again. He watched them for 40 minutes. They ran the drill 11 times. By the 11th repetition, the 3rd position's overcommitment had reduced to a hesitation rather than a failure. Not fixed, but trending toward fixed. The correction working its way into the pattern through the specific mechanism of doing the thing wrong enough times to understand where the wrongness lived. An involuntary thought arrived. They are doing what I do. He dismissed it. They were not doing what he did. What they were doing was a pale, functional echo of the thing he did, the way a candle echoed a star. The same basic phenomenon operating at a scale so different as to constitute a different category of thing. They were humans with training. He was a Viltrumite with 1,000 years. The thought did not entirely leave. It reduced to a lower volume and stayed. The shift in the training sessions happened without either of them naming it, which was the only way it could have happened. Conquest had begun making corrections before the failures, not dramatically, not a wholesale change in methodology, small things. A hand on Mark's wrist, redirecting the position 2 inches before the technique would have demonstrated the error. A tap on the outside of his knee, Adjusting the stance before the drill showed what the wrong stance produced. The corrections were physical and wordless, and delivered with the economy of someone who had determined that showing was faster than waiting for the consequence to demonstrate. Mark began anticipating them. The first time it happened, it was small enough that Conquest almost missed it. Mark's weight shifted to the correct distribution a half-second before Conquest's hand reached for the adjustment. Conquest stopped. He looked at Mark's stance. He looked at where his hand had been going. He started the drill again without comment. The second time, it was unambiguous. Mark self-corrected through an entire footwork sequence. 6 positions, each. Won the correct position without a single touch from Conquest. He came out of the sequence and held the final stance, and looked at Conquest. Conquest looked back at him. He started the next drill. But later in the session, during a water interval, he said without setup or segue, "When did you first understand you were stronger than humans?" Mark looked at him. The question was unexpected enough that his face did the thing it always did when something caught him off guard. A slight reorganization of expression that he was still learning to suppress. Pretty early. My dad had to explain why I couldn't. He stopped, recalibrated. I couldn't play the same way. Couldn't tackle someone in football. Couldn't shake someone's hand without managing it. Why are you stopping? I'm trying to figure out why you're asking. I'm mapping your control development. Conquest set down the water container he'd been holding, not drinking from, just holding the way he held objects during intervals. Your precision comes from that training, not from Viltrumite discipline. Is that bad? A pause. The ventilation system in the ceiling ran through its pressure cycle. Conquest's prosthetic hand moved, the small, habitual flex that had been appearing with increasing frequency, the calibration movement that had started as a deliberate test of the arm's function and had become something else without his noticing. It means you carry 2 sets of instincts, he said. Most Viltrumites have 1. That could be a liability. Another pause. Or it could be... He stopped. Mark waited. Or it could be what? That's enough for today. He walked to the equipment rack and began the reset sequence for the next section of the session. Mark watched his back for a moment. He'd heard the sentence try to come out. He'd heard where it was going before it stopped. He filed this in the same place he'd been filing other things that happened in this room. Observations he didn't have the full context for yet, but that were accumulating into a shape he was starting to be able to read. The humor happened by accident, which was the only way it could have happened. It was day 23. Mark had been running a solo technique sequence while Conquest observed and periodically disrupted, stepping in without warning to test whether the technique held under unexpected pressure. On his 4th run, Mark misjudged a footwork transition and lost the position and went sideways onto the floor in a way that was undignified rather than injurious. He lay on his back for a second, looking at the concrete ceiling. "I think I'm getting worse, not better," he said, to the ceiling. Not to Conquest specifically. "You're not." Conquest was standing at the edge of his visual field, having apparently already assessed the fall and determined it required no response. Mark turned his head. "Oh, so that wasn't terrible?" "It was terrible. A beat. It was better terrible than last week's terrible." Mark looked at him. Is that your version of a compliment?" Conquest didn't answer. He moved to the next position and waited for Mark to get up. He was looking at the equipment on the wall, not at Mark. His expression was whatever his expression was, the same flat, analytical surface it had maintained across 23 days of this. But he hadn't denied it. Mark got up, he lined up for the next sequence, and for reasons he didn't examine too carefully in the moment, something in his chest had loosened by approximately a degree. The evening session ran long on day 27. They had been working a specific combination, 3 movements, a setup, and 2 executors, the kind of technique that required enough repetition to become structural rather than procedural. Mark had been running it for 2 hours, getting incrementally closer to the version that Conquest was looking for. The session ended without ceremony. Conquest stepped back, and Mark understood the session was over, and they separated. Mark toward the exit, and Conquest toward the equipment to begin the reset sequence. Then Conquest stopped. He walked back to the center of the floor. He watched Mark's back for a moment. Mark had reached the door but hadn't gone through it yet, was working through the combination in his head, his hands moving through the positions slightly as he walked. Conquest picked up a length of steel rod from the debris pile against the south wall. It had been bent into a right angle during an earlier session's damage and had been sitting in the pile since maintenance had flagged it for disposal. He ran the prosthetic hand along its length, finding the stress point, and then applied pressure at the angle and bent it back straight. He set it in the equipment rack rather than the disposal pile. He sat down on the floor near the rack, which he had never done before, always standing, always in a functional position, always oriented toward the next thing. He sat and watched the door where Mark had been. Mark had already gone through it. Conquest was watching an empty door. He stayed there for 11 minutes. He didn't touch the rod again. He sat with the particular quality of stillness that was not rest. He didn't rest, not in any way that resembled the human concept, but that was something adjacent to it. Something that had no immediate task. Something that was, very briefly, just present. The next morning, Mark arrived at the training floor at 0547, 13 minutes early. He had never been early before. The equipment was already laid out. The session configuration had been arranged. Specific apparatus positioned for the combination work they'd been running. The floor cleared of the prior session's debris. Everything ready for him to walk in and begin. Conquest was working the weighted apparatus on the far end of the floor with the prosthetic arm, running through his own conditioning work with the specific economy of someone for whom movement is the baseline state rather than an activity. He didn't look up when Mark entered. Mark looked at the prepared floor, at the laid-out equipment, at Conquest's back across the room. He walked to his starting position and began his warm sequence. Neither of them said anything. The ventilation system hummed. The fluorescent lights ran their constant frequency. The session hadn't technically started yet, and both of them were already in the room, and the room felt in some quality that neither of them would have been able to name, and neither of them tried to, slightly different than it had the day before. Conquest finished his conditioning set. He turned. Again from the setup, he said. Mark moved. The night that became the chapter's center arrived without announcement, which was appropriate. Mark found Conquest on the perimeter, the northern shelf of rock, the position he used every night. The security detail was at their standard distance. The Nevada sky was clear, which at this altitude and light pollution level meant genuinely clear. A density of stars that the facility's underground existence made easy to forget was available. Mark came up without announcement and sat on the rock shelf at a remove. Not beside Conquest, not at the distance of deliberate separation, but the specific intermediate position of someone who has learned how much proximity this particular being tolerates and is calibrating to it. Neither of them spoke for a while. Among the stars, somewhere in a direction that Conquest's celestial navigation could have identified to within a narrow margin, the Armada was moving. It was always moving now. The timeline had compressed, and the Armada existed as a constant background fact in everyone in the facility's operational awareness. Not panic, but the specific gravitational pull of an approaching event that was going to be definitive regardless of preparation. Mark said, "How many planets?" Conquest didn't react to the question the way someone reacts to an unexpected question. He'd been waiting for something, and this was what arrived. 73 campaigns in which I had command, he said. Individual actions. A pause. Many. Did any of them fight? All of them fought. That's why we had to be there. He looked at the horizon. Things that didn't fight were already broken. Mark processed this. He didn't react to it, didn't editorialize, didn't challenge it. He was asking questions to understand something, not to argue with the answers. Did you ever think about what came after, for the ones that survived? The Empire provides order, infrastructure, resources. The subjugated civilizations are, he stopped, restarted with a different word, managed. Managed, alive, more alive than if they'd resisted to the end and been wiped out. Is that what you told yourself? The question sat in the Nevada air. Not aggressive, the phrasing wasn't confrontational. It was genuinely curious in the specific way of someone trying to understand the internal mechanics of a thing they're looking at. No, Conquest said. The word arrived flat and without deflection. I didn't tell myself anything. There was no need for a narrative. The work was correct by the logic of the Empire. I didn't require a story to do it. And now? The stars moved in their geological pace overhead. Somewhere to the east, the emergency services radio traffic that Conquest had been monitoring through his earpiece for weeks ran its ordinary channel chatter. Units cycling, overnight incidents, the operational murmur of a civilization going about its night. Now I am standing on a planet that is going to be attacked by that logic, Conquest said. And I am... He stopped. The pause had a different quality than his usual pauses. Not processing time, not the economy of a careful communicator, something that didn't have a category, preparing to resist it. Mark waited. "It is a strange thing," Conquest said. "I have never been on this side before." "Which side?" He looked at Mark, the single eye, catching the starlight at an angle that made it legible for a moment, in a way it rarely was. Not soft, nothing like soft, but present. Fully present in the way of something that has stopped performing its customary distance and is simply there. "The one that has something worth losing," he said. He looked back at the horizon. Mark didn't respond. He didn't have a response that wouldn't diminish what had just been said, and he'd learned, 30-something days of this had taught him, that the correct answer to certain things was the absence of response, that Conquest's vocabulary for honesty was limited and hard-won, and the worst thing you could do with a rare instance of it was fill it with noise. They sat on the rock shelf, and the stars moved overhead, and the Armada moved somewhere in the dark between them and everything else. Nolan had come out for the perimeter check, ostensibly. What he'd actually come out for was standing 12 feet behind the security detail, which was 30 feet behind the rock shelf, which meant he was close enough to hear and far enough to be technically absent from the conversation. He heard everything. He stood in the Nevada dark and heard Conquest say the thing Conquest had said, and he looked at the two figures on the rock shelf, the ancient warrior and the teenage half-blood sitting in the intermediate distance that was exactly the right distance for what they were to each other. And he felt something that didn't organize into words. He went back inside without making his presence known to either of them. He went to the vault on level 6 and stood in front of the barrier where the carved cylinder sat and looked at it for a while. He didn't touch the barrier. He just looked. After a time, he went to his room and did not sleep until well past midnight. Morning. The training floor before the session. Conquest arrived first and set the equipment. This had become the pattern without being decided. He came early, arranged the floor for what he'd determined the session required, and was working his own conditioning when Mark arrived. The session started when Mark was ready rather than at a fixed time, which was a modification from the original schedule that neither of them had discussed, and both of them had adopted. Mark came through the door and looked at the floor configuration. He read it, the specific equipment placement, the distance markers, the apparatus Conquest had chosen, and understood what today was. "Last push before the storm," he said. "You're going to fight Viltrumites today." Conquest didn't stop the arm exercise he was running. "Not simulations. Me, at higher capacity than I've shown you, I need to know where you actually are. And if I'm not where you need me to be, then we'll fix it." Conquest set down the equipment and turned to face the floor. "We have time." Mark looked at him. The qualifier hung in the air between them. Not a reassurance, Conquest didn't do reassurances, but something in the same territory. Something that had been calculated and delivered because the calculation had determined it was true, and Conquest said true things. "Do we?" Mark said. Conquest looked at him directly. The prosthetic hand flexed once. The calibration movement, the habitual one, the one that had started as a test and become something else. "Enough," he said. The word landed the way small, precise things land when they've been carrying weight the whole time. Not a comfort. A fact. The kind of fact that required everything Conquest had spent 30-something days developing to deliver with any credibility, and that had that credibility precisely because of everything it had taken to get here. Mark nodded once. He walked to his starting position. Conquest moved to the center of the floor. The session began. The monitoring network flagged the inbound signature at 0311 on a Wednesday. It was a single contact, not an advance formation, not a probe with support elements. One being, moving at the specific velocity that Viltrumite travel produced when the traveler was not attempting concealment, which was itself information. A Viltrumite who wasn't hiding was either supremely confident or carrying a sanctioned commission. In the current operational context, both possibilities resolved to the same problem. Cecil was in the operations room within 4 minutes. He looked at the tracking data, ran the approach vector forward to its probable ground contact, and turned to the analyst on duty. "How long?" 40 minutes to atmosphere. Another 15 to ground contact if she doesn't decelerate. Cecil said. "Energy signature profile. Our Viltrumite database puts the mass and velocity pattern consistent with a female physiology." Cecil looked at the screen for another 3 seconds. Then he picked up the secure line to level 4. Conquest went completely still when the description came through. He was standing at the equipment rack, mid-reset from the previous day's session. His hand, the prosthetic one, was holding a weight plate that he had been returning to the rack and was now simply holding, not moving, while the rest of him processed what Cecil had just described. The stillness lasted 4 seconds. Then he set the weight plate down with the same care he set everything down and turned to face Cecil's voice through the room's speaker. "She's here to confirm what the Empire already suspects," he said, "that I survived and have been giving intelligence to the planet." He paused. "Thragg sent her specifically. She came here before. Under different orders. She knows this planet's defenders firsthand." He would have calculated that prior knowledge as an advantage for a scouting insertion. Nolan, whom had come down when the alert went out, was standing in the doorway. "If she reports back, she won't. You can't. I'll handle the scout." Conquest moved to the training floor's center. His posture had shifted. Not visibly, not in any way that someone without extensive observation of him would have caught. But the quality of how he occupied the room was different. The pre-session calibration mode had ended, and something older had come forward. "Keep the boy ready, but out of my sight initially. I want to see what he does with the real thing before I intervene." Nolan's jaw tightened. He looked at Conquest with the expression of a man working through an argument he could already see he wasn't going to win. He's not ready for a full Viltrumite. He's going to have to fight them. Conquest looked at him. Single eye, flat, carrying the specific weight of a fact being stated rather than an opinion being offered. Better to find out what he can do now than when Thragg brings 40. The silence that followed was Nolan doing the math. The math resolved the same way Conquest's had, because the math was the same math. Nolan looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. "If she gets past Mark..." "She won't get past Mark," Conquest said. "She'll get close. There's a difference." The Nevada basin stretched flat and empty under a sky that was beginning to lighten at its eastern edge. Not dawn yet, but the preliminary state of things before dawn, when the dark is losing its conviction. Cecil's team had run the evacuation of the relevant sector in 31 minutes, which was a record for the protocol, and which Cecil had noted in his operational log, with the particular satisfaction of a man who builds systems and enjoys watching them function. Mark came in from altitude, which was correct. Maintaining elevation until the contact's position was confirmed gave him the best available options for approach. He had not been told everything. He had been told, Viltrumite scout, advance of the main invasion, intercept and prevent departure. The operational parameters were clean. The emotional reality of being asked to fight a full Viltrumite for the first time since the training began was something he was managing in the specific way he'd been learning to manage things, by running the Conquest protocols in his head, the footwork, the commitment threshold, the kill-or-don't-kill question already resolved into a framework he could access without having to rebuild it under pressure. Anissa came in fast and low, which was not standard approach doctrine for a scouting insertion. She had identified the evacuation pattern from altitude and understood she'd been flagged, and a Viltrumite who has already been flagged has nothing to gain from subtlety. She landed hard in the basin floor and came upright in a single motion and looked at the sky where Mark was descending. The fight that followed was 4 minutes and 17 seconds. By Cecil's timestamp, in those 4 minutes, what was visible to the observers, Conquest from a position on the elevated ridge to the north, Nolan at Cecil's side in the mobile command vehicle, was the clearest possible demonstration of what 30 days of Conquest's training had produced, and where the ceiling of that production currently sat. Mark was different, not marginally, not in ways that required specialist knowledge to detect, fundamentally different in his combat architecture. The footwork that had been carrying too much weight in his dominant side was balanced now. His entries were clean, the weight distribution correct, the approach angles choosing the positions that created problems for his opponent rather than ones that felt natural to him. He didn't telegraph. On 3 separate exchanges, Anissa committed to a counter that Mark wasn't where she expected him to be, and the adjustment she had to make gave him the angle he'd been building toward. He landed meaningful strikes. Against a full Viltrumite, this was not nothing, but the power differential was the power differential. Technique could narrow it. It couldn't bridge it. By the 2-minute mark, Anissa had recalibrated to Mark's patterns and was applying the physics of the situation in the way that physics eventually always insisted on asserting. Mark took a hit to his left side that he couldn't completely redirect. He got some of the angle, turned maybe 40% of the force, and took the remaining 60% into his rib cage. He went down. He got up. He took another hit, this one to the shoulder from above, driving him into the basin floor at an angle that put cracks in the hardpan in a 2-foot radius. He got up from this one more slowly. His left arm was operating at reduced capacity. His breathing had changed. He was still looking for the angle, still moving his eyes across Anissa's positioning, reading her weight, reading the tells she didn't know she had because nobody had ever needed to read them before. The intelligence Conquest had drilled into him was still running. It just didn't have enough physical backing left to execute on what it was finding. Anissa moved for the finishing position. Not a killing blow, a control position, the kind of hold that ended a fight by removing the other party's ability to continue it. She was fast, faster than Mark could cover with his current arm. Conquest came out of the sky. He did not announce it. He was on the ridge, and then he was in the basin in the interval between one moment and the next, moving at a velocity that put him between Anissa and Mark before Anissa's strike had completed its arc. His prosthetic hand closed around her arm at the midpoint of the swing, not catching it, controlling it, the specific difference between stopping a force and redirecting it to zero. He held the grip. Anissa spun to face him. The recognition moved through her face in sequence. The initial threat assessment response, then the identification. Then something that a Viltrumite's face did when a threat assessment produced an impossible result, and the system had to run the calculation again to confirm it. Her expression didn't show fear, but it showed the recalculation. That was enough. "You're alive." Her voice was flat. Operational. Thragg said, "I know what Thragg said." Conquest released her arm. One step back. The prosthetic hand dropped to his side. He was wrong. No elaboration, no speech. The statement was complete, and everything that followed it was going to be physical. He hit her. The fight between Conquest and Anissa was not long. This was the thing that the observers processed in real time. Not the outcome, which was inevitable once Conquest had entered the engagement, but the pace of the outcome. Anissa was a capable, experienced Viltrumite warrior. Mark had lasted 4 minutes against her, while operating at compromised capacity. Conquest dismantled her in under 2. Not through speed, not primarily, through the specific quality that Conquest fought with. The certainty fighter's approach, the one that worked by removing possibilities rather than by winning exchanges. Before Anissa had committed to any approach, the approach was already expensive. Before she'd executed any counter, the counter had already been accounted for. He wasn't reacting to her. He was operating 3 positions ahead of her and waiting for her to catch up. His prosthetic arm absorbed 3 strikes that would have been meaningful on the flesh arm. He'd oriented his defense to put the prosthetic in the path of her power, using it as structural armor while the flesh arm did the targeting work. The engineers had overbuilt the elbow joint. Cecil's decision to add 40% looked, from the inside of this engagement, like precisely calibrated intelligence. The strike that ended it was a specific pressure point application to the junction between Anissa's jaw and neck. Not lethal, not designed to be, but calibrated to disrupt vestibular function, enough to compromise flight and sustained directional movement. She went down and stayed down, not unconscious but functionally incapable of departure under her own power. Conquest stood over her. He was breathing at the same rate he breathed at rest. He looked at her on the ground for a moment with the expression he looked at everything with. Then he looked at Mark. Mark had watched the whole engagement from where he'd landed after pulling himself from Anissa's final strike. He was upright, arm still compromised, ribs still reporting. He had watched what a millennium of this looked like applied to the same opponent he'd been fighting 4 minutes ago. The gap between what he'd done and what Conquest had done was not a gap he could fully process in the moment. It was the kind of information that required time to metabolize. He understood something watching Conquest turn toward him, not just what Conquest had taught him, what Conquest was, what the ceiling above Mark's current ceiling looked like, and what it meant that a thing operating at that ceiling had chosen to be here, on this rock shelf, in this basin, in this war. The GDA team arrived in vehicles trailing dust from the access road. The 3 of them, Conquest, Mark, Nolan, stood in a loose configuration near Anissa's position, while Cecil's people set up the containment protocols. Mark looked at Anissa, at the ground team securing her, at the sky, which was fully light now, the Nevada morning making everything flat and bright and specific. "What happens to her?" he said. "She can't be released." Conquest's voice was back to its operational register, the particular flatness that meant he was processing rather than deciding. She'll report to the Armada. We're not killing her. Conquest looked at Nolan. The look carried an entire question in it. Nolan said, yes. Conquest looked back at the middle distance. A pause that had the quality of something being filed rather than argued with. Fine. Cecil's facility. Maximum containment. She'll be there when the war is over and she can answer for herself then. He walked away. Not toward the vehicles, not toward any specific destination, just away, along the basin floor, putting distance between himself and the configuration of people and decisions, and the specific residue of what had just happened. Mark watched him go. He protected me, he said. Nolan said, yes, he's not going to say that's what he was doing. No. Mark looked at the direction Conquest had walked, at the figure moving across the flat hardpan with the unhurried certainty of something that had made its calculation and was done with the making of it. Is that what he was doing? Nolan was quiet for a moment. The GDA team worked around them, efficient, professional, doing the logistical work that followed this kind of event. He stopped the fight before she could have finished you, Nolan said. What would you call it? Mark didn't answer. He watched Conquest until the distance made him difficult to read clearly. He didn't have a word for it yet, but the shape of it was clear enough, and the shape was the part that mattered. The operations room on level 5 had the particular quality of a space where bad news had been delivered so many times that the walls had absorbed it. Cecil stood at the main display with his senior tactical staff arranged in a configuration that communicated by the specific distance each person maintained from the others. That, what was being said, was the kind of thing nobody wanted to be standing too close to. Conquest stood at the room's edge. Not seated, he hadn't used a chair in a meeting since his first week in the facility, and no one had raised it again after the first time. He listened with his arms at his sides and his eye moving across the tactical display with the attention of someone who was running the numbers before the analysts finished presenting them. Cecil laid it out without softening. Anissa's failure to report back meant the Empire knew something had gone wrong on the scouting mission. The Armada's timeline had been built around confirmed scout intelligence. Without that confirmation, Thragg would not proceed on the original schedule. He would accelerate or he would send another probe, and sending another probe took time that accelerating did not. He'll accelerate, Conquest said. Cecil looked at him. You're certain? Thragg does not send probes when probes have failed. He sends the conclusion. Conquest moved to the display without being invited to and pulled up the formation diagram he'd drawn in the first week. The original invasion architecture, the approach vectors, the order of engagement. The formation I described assumes standard approach doctrine. He knows I know the doctrine. He looked at the display for a moment. Assume he deviates. Plan for 3 vectors, not 1. Can you give us the deviation permutations? I'll give them to you tonight. All of them. He'll pick one of 4, and I can tell you which one he'll avoid and which one he'll choose between. He stepped back from the display. The question isn't which vector. The question is whether your civilian evacuation infrastructure can run faster than his approach timeline if he comes in at the aggressive end. Cecil turned to his operations lead. The operations lead was already pulling up the evacuation protocol timelines. The room recalibrated around the new information without requiring anyone to explicitly process that Conquest had just walked into their operational planning meeting, identified the correct question, and answered it before they'd asked it. Cecil made a note. It was filed under Asset, Unexpected Contributions, and was the 31st entry in that category. The preparation work ran across the following 2 weeks in parallel threads that occupied every level of the facility simultaneously. Conquest worked with the GDA's weapons systems engineers on the 3rd day, a session that Cecil had arranged with minimal expectation and that ran for 9 hours. The engineers had built their defensive arrays based on the general Viltrumite physiological profile, impact resistance, velocity management, the standard parameters. Conquest sat at their workbench and reviewed their specifications, and then began marking specific modifications. The modifications were not general, they were individual. He knew the incoming Armada's composition from his intelligence brief, knew which warriors were deployed, knew their combat histories, knew the specific injuries they'd sustained and recovered from over the years, and how those recoveries had changed their defensive behaviors. He had fought or trained alongside most of them at some point across 1,000 years. An analyst asked him at the session's midpoint how he had such specific knowledge of the incoming soldiers' individual vulnerabilities. Conquest looked at the analyst with the single eye. Because I gave most of them those weaknesses. The room went quiet in the specific way of rooms, where a statement has arrived that requires a moment's processing before anyone is sure what they're supposed to do with it. Conquest returned to the specifications. The modifications continued. Mark spent the preparation period running coordination work with Earth's existing hero contingent, a logistical task that Cecil had structured carefully, aware that Mark's presence would carry the weight of his father's reputation in some quarters and his own complicated history in others. He moved through it with the particular competence of someone who had been learning, over the last month, to read a room the way you read an opponent. Fast, comprehensive, looking for the structural problem rather than the surface one. He came back to the training floor every evening, not always with Conquest's direction, sometimes alone, running the sequences, working the combinations, doing the kind of practice that happened after you'd moved past needing to be told to do it. On 2 of those evenings, Conquest was already there when he arrived. They didn't discuss it. The atmosphere gave the first warning. Not the monitoring network. The atmosphere itself, which registered the incoming mass, the way water registers a stone dropped from height. A pressure change that propagated downward through the layers. A differential that the wildlife in the Nevada basin felt before any sensor flagged it. Birds went up from their roosts in the pre-dawn dark and didn't come back down. The coyotes that ran the flat ground east of the facility went quiet, and then were gone, which Kowalski, the security lead, noticed from the perimeter and reported to Cecil at 0418 as an anomalous environmental indicator that she couldn't technically classify as a threat, but that she felt, professionally, required noting. Cecil had the operations room on full alert by 0421. At 0429, the monitoring network caught the leading edge of the formation. At 0431, it stopped being a monitoring issue and became something else. The sky above the Nevada basin changed the way a room changes when the lights are cut. Not gradually, not with warning. The stars in a specific sector of the upper atmosphere simply stopped being visible, occluded by something that was moving faster than weather and had a thermal signature that no weather produced. Then the first re-entry trails appeared. Not one, not a formation of 3 or 4. Dozens. Bright lines in the dark upper atmosphere, each one a body decelerating from interstellar velocity, each one producing enough frictional heat to be visible from the surface as a moving streak of orange-white light. Cecil's voice on the operations channel, completely level. All units. This is not a drill. Conquest was already outside. He had been on the perimeter when the birds went up, and had understood, from the birds and from the pressure differential, that his physiology registered several seconds before the monitoring network caught it. What was arriving? He stood on the northern shelf of rock and watched the re-entry trails multiply across the sky above him, and counted them with the professional attention of someone who has seen this from the other side enough times to read the formation from its visual signature. He had his count before Cecil's analysts had finished their initial assessment. He turned when he heard footsteps. Not from threat response, just acknowledgement. Mark landed beside him. Nolan came in from the east, having been running his own perimeter pattern. The 3 of them stood on the rock shelf and looked at the sky, which was now visibly wrong in the direction of every compass point, the re-entry trails forming a spreading pattern that resolved, if you knew what you were looking at, into the specific geometry of a coordinated approach. Conquest spoke without looking at them. Standard penetration array, 7 frontline shock troops in the lead descent. The remaining elements are support and consolidation. He tracked the pattern across the sky. Reading it, Thragg won't be in the vanguard. He doesn't expose himself until the perimeter is broken and the initial resistance is assessed. His eye moved from the northern trails to the southern. He's watching. Somewhere above the cloud layer. Waiting. Mark was looking at the spread of trails. How do we... Southern vector is mid-tier. That's yours. Conquest turned to him. The assessment in the single eye was complete and fast. Mark's current state, his readiness, the specific things the last 35 days had built, and the specific things they hadn't been able to finish building. The calculation resolved in under 2 seconds. Don't engage the center formation. The warriors in the middle cluster are executioners. They're designed to fight other Viltrumites in direct, sustained combat. Against them, your technique advantage disappears, and only the physics remain. Work the flanks. Stay mobile. Trust the footwork. Mark held the look. He nodded. Go, Conquest said. Mark went, straight up, fast, into the dark above the basin. Conquest watched him for exactly 1 second. Then he looked back at the sky. He cracked his knuckles. The prosthetic hand first, each finger individually, the joints of the mechanical structure producing the specific sound of engineered materials under controlled tension. Then the flesh hand, familiar sound, old sound, the knuckles that had been cracking in pre-fight preparation for 1,000 years. He looked at Nolan. Civilian corridors are your responsibility. The southern residential sectors if the formation spreads, which it will by the second wave. Nolan said, I know. A beat between them. 2,000 years of context in the space of 4 seconds. Don't die doing something stupid, Conquest said. Nolan almost smiled. Same. Conquest went up. He moved through the invading Viltrumites the way a demolition charge moves through a structure. Not randomly, not with visible rage, but with the specific, targeted efficiency of something that has identified the load-bearing elements and is working through them in the correct sequence. He didn't speak during the engagement. He didn't announce himself. The first 3 Viltrumites he reached were in the process of establishing their ground positions, the consolidation formation beginning its work, and they understood what was happening at approximately the moment it had already happened, which was the interval Conquest had been operating in for 1,000 years. The 4th warrior he reached recognized him. It was a Viltrumite named Krev, whose combat history Conquest knew in detail because he had reviewed it during the preparation period. Age: 600 and some years, Eastern Campaign veteran. The specific style that came from 2 centuries of suppression work on worlds with atmospheric flight capability. Krev's rhythm broke when he registered Conquest's face. Not dramatically, not a flinch, not a backward step, because he was Viltrumite and those responses had been trained out of him centuries ago. But his commitment to the exchange he'd been setting up fractionally hesitated. Conquest used the hesitation. He didn't look at Krev afterward. He was already moving to the next position. There was one exception to this. The 7th warrior he reached was older than Krev, older than most of the formation. He had the specific physical vocabulary of someone who had been doing this for centuries before Conquest's own career had started. The economy of movement, the precise weight distribution, the way his guard was positioned to account for attack approaches that most warriors never thought to anticipate because most warriors hadn't been fighting long enough to have encountered them. Conquest knew him, had known him for 400 years, had fought beside him on 11 campaigns, had once, on a world whose name he still carried, pulled this warrior out of a collapse that should have ended him. They looked at each other across 20 feet of Nevada hardpan. There was no conversation. There was a moment of recognition, mutual, complete, carrying everything that 4 centuries of shared history amounted to when the shared history ended here, in a desert basin, on a planet neither of them had chosen, on opposite sides of a line that neither of them had anticipated drawing. Then the fight. Conquest won. He always won. This was not arrogance, it was the operational reality of a millennium of competition at the highest available level, which produced a combatant whose ceiling was currently occupied by exactly 2 beings in the known universe, and neither of them was this warrior. The fight was real. It cost something. The warrior he'd pulled from a collapse 4 centuries ago knew things about how Conquest moved that most opponents didn't, and he used them, and some of them still worked. He went down. Conquest stood over him for one moment. His breathing was controlled. His expression was the expression it always was. He looked at the fallen warrior with a single eye for the specific duration of a being marking something before moving on. Then he moved on. South of Conquest's arc, Mark was doing what Conquest had told him to do. The mid-tier Viltrumites on the southern vector were not the executioners. They were competent, trained, operating with the specific professional efficiency of warriors who had done this on enough worlds to have developed reliable methodology. Against any Earth-tier opponent, they would have constituted an overwhelming force. Against Mark, they were something else. Not an easy fight, not a winnable fight in straight attrition, but a workable problem, which was what Conquest had spent 35 days teaching him to see every fight as. He identified the first one's tell in the second exchange, the slight forward lean before a committed strike, the weight distribution that gave away the power shot before the power shot arrived. He'd seen it before, not from this specific warrior, from the drill sequences, from Conquest applying enough variety that eventually the patterns underneath the variety became visible. He stopped trying to match the warrior's speed. He planted, let the tell complete, moved at the moment of commitment rather than before it, and the strike that would have connected with his head connected with air. His counter hit the exposed left side. The warrior recalibrated. Mark recalibrated faster. 4 exchanges later, the warrior was down. He moved to the next one. This one was faster and had no tell he could find in the first 30 seconds. He took 2 significant hits while he was looking, the first across his right shoulder, the second to his midsection, both of which produced the specific inventory updating sensation of damage his body was going to be processing for days. He didn't stop moving. The footwork, always the footwork. Staying out of the position that made the third hit easy, keeping the geometry of the engagement in a shape he could work with. He found the tell at 40 seconds. It wasn't in the movement, it was in the eyes, which tracked a fraction of a second before the body followed. He wasn't sure Conquest had specifically taught him this. He thought he might have just watched Conquest often enough that some of how Conquest read opponents had transferred without a dedicated lesson. He filed this for later. The fight required him now. He won the exchange. He moved to the next one. The battle ran for 40 minutes before the formation broke. It broke faster than Thragg had designed for, the specific, consequential result of 2 things his formation hadn't accounted for. Mark's combat capability, which his intelligence on Earth's defenders had placed significantly lower than its current state, and Conquest, whose presence in the engagement was an impossibility his operational planning hadn't required accounting for, because Conquest was supposed to be dead. The formation's front line fractured, the consolidation elements, the warriors who were supposed to be establishing ground positions while the shock troops cleared opposition, were instead managing the specific crisis of a battle going wrong faster than their doctrine provided for. The center cluster held. The flanks did not. A single warrior broke upward, not running in the panicked sense, but retreating in the deliberate sense of someone who has assessed a situation, determined that the situation has exceeded its parameters, and is carrying that assessment to the authority responsible for the next decision. Conquest let him go. Nolan, who had returned from the civilian corridor work and was positioned near Conquest's current ground position, watched the retreating warrior climb into the upper atmosphere and said, "He'll report to Thragg." Yes, Conquest tracked the retreating figure until the altitude made it small. "That's why I'm letting him run. I want Thragg to come down himself." Nolan looked at him. "You're drawing him out. The soldiers aren't the threat. They've never been the threat. Thragg staying above the engagement, managing it, assessing it, waiting for the right moment to commit. That's the threat." He watched the upper atmosphere where the warrior had gone. Thragg is patient in every engagement, but not in every situation. A formation failing, he can absorb from above and replace. Learning that I am alive, that I have been standing on this planet, that the intelligence he believed was buried in space went instead to the wrong side, that is not something he can file away and manage from altitude. That becomes personal, and Thragg does not manage personal things from a distance. And once he commits personally, you have the approach. Yes, he looked at Nolan. The moment he commits personally, I have the approach. Around them, the battle's immediate activity was winding down. The remaining formation elements were either contained or withdrawing. Earth's heroes were running the infrastructure protection work. Cecil's channel was reporting civilian corridors clear. The Nevada basin was quieter than it had been 30 minutes ago, which was a strange quality after what the last 30 minutes had contained. Nolan said, "Conquest, if you go at Thragg one-on-one, I know. You know what he is. I helped make him what he is." Conquest looked at the upper atmosphere where the retreating warrior had gone. "I trained with him before he had the regent's rank, before the mandate, before he decided that the thing that made him the strongest was also the thing that made him right." His jaw moved, the specific movement of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and is deciding one last time whether to carry it further or set it down. I know exactly what he does when he's losing. That's what matters. And if he isn't losing? Conquest looked at Nolan, the single eye in the early morning light of a desert that had just been a battlefield. Something in it that was not fear. Conquest's face didn't do fear. The architecture wasn't there. But something adjacent to it, something that acknowledged, without performance, what he was facing. "Then you make sure the boy finishes it," he said. Nolan held the look for a long moment. He didn't argue. He didn't add anything. He understood what was being said, and he let himself understand it, which was the hardest part. The cloud layer above the basin shifted, through the gap that the shift created, visible for a moment, and then gone again. A figure descending, not fast, not with the urgency of the initial formation. Deliberate, controlled. the specific pace of something that has assessed what has happened below and is now arriving to address it personally. Conquest turned toward it. He stood in the Nevada basin in the early morning light, one arm flesh and one arm engineered metal, a face that was 1,000 years of war, and he looked up at the Grand Regent of the Viltrumite Empire coming down through the cloud layer. Across the ruined landscape, nobody else existed. Thragg landed without impact. This was the first thing, the thing that established what the next several minutes were going to be. A Viltrumite at combat velocity landed with force that the ground registered. Thragg descended at the specific speed of a being that had calculated exactly how much deceleration was required to arrive at the surface without producing a crater, and had applied exactly that much, and not one fraction more. He landed as if he had simply stopped being airborne, his feet finding the Nevada hardpan with the precision of something that had never in its existence moved without complete control of the movement. He was not wearing the Grand Regent's formal presentation. He was in the configuration he used for operations, not stripped down, not performing humility, but functional. The gray beard, the face that had been making unilateral decisions about the fates of civilizations for longer than most species had been writing things down, the posture of absolute certainty that wasn't performed because it had never needed to be. He looked at Conquest. "You should have died in space," he said. Not with anger, with the specific quality of a man notating a discrepancy, the difference between a predicted outcome and an observed one, stated in the same register you'd use to read a weather report that had failed to account for local conditions. Conquest was already moving. The first exchange established the architecture of what this was going to be. Conquest opened at full output, no calibration phase, no assessment period. Because he didn't need one. He had trained with Thragg before Thragg was the Grand Regent, had fought against him in one formal engagement, and a dozen less formal ones, knew his approach geometry the way you knew the geography of a place you'd lived in for 4 centuries. He opened with a combination designed specifically for what he knew of Thragg's guard preference. High line, right side, the specific entry angle that had troubled Thragg the most across their shared history. Thragg took the combination, not blocked, absorbed. The difference mattered. A blocked strike gets redirected, which carries information about what the blocker is doing. Thragg stood inside Conquest's combination and let the force arrive and processed it, and responded with a single strike to Conquest's left side that moved him back 53 feet across the hard pan. Conquest hit the far edge of a debris field from the earlier battle, rubble and displaced stone and the remnants of 2 engagement craters, and came out of it already recalibrating. The left side was reporting. The hit had not been at Thragg's ceiling. He'd delivered it from a static position, not with the full commitment of a charged strike, which meant it was approximately 60% of what Thragg could produce when he wanted to produce it. 60% of Thragg's maximum had just moved Conquest 53 feet. He had known this going in. The knowing did not change what came next. He came back. "That's twice now you've been wrong about that," Conquest said. He was circling, keeping his velocity variable. The specific tactic of a fighter who knows that their opponent's ability to time strikes depends on predicting approach rhythm. He varied the distance, varied the angle, gave Thragg as few fixed reference points as possible. Thragg tracked him with the patience of something that had learned, over millennia. That patience was the correct response to almost every situation, because almost every situation eventually produced the moment of maximum advantage, if you waited for it. "Why are you here?" Thragg said. "This planet isn't worth what you're spending. The planet never was the point." Thragg looked at him. A recalibration. Small, internal, but visible to someone who had known him long enough to read the micro-adjustments. "Me? You?" Something moved in Thragg's expression that was not quite respect, and was not quite surprise. Something that acknowledged, in the clinical way that Thragg acknowledged things, that the data point was interesting. "And here I thought I'd ended your ability to make poor decisions." Conquest came in. The tactical game ran for 8 minutes. Conquest forced Thragg to cover ground. This was the specific challenge of fighting something you couldn't outpower. You made it work. You got it moving laterally, get it covering distance it didn't choose to cover, get it operating outside the preferred engagement geometry. Every time Thragg established a position, Conquest made the position expensive by making it necessary to move from. The debris field became a forcing mechanism. Conquest drove Thragg into configurations where the rubble required navigating or caused a split second of positional management. Thragg recognized this. He was not a fool and had never been one. He recognized the tactic and applied his counter to it: patience. He let Conquest move him. He absorbed the forcing and tracked the pattern, and waited for the forcing to produce the commitment that all forcing eventually produced. The moment when the pusher has to commit to the push, or reveal that the push was never going anywhere. He took 3 strikes in this phase that he hadn't needed to take, not because he couldn't avoid them, because avoiding them would have required abandoning positions that were more valuable than the hit cost. He traded impact for ground. He was doing math that Conquest was also doing, and they were both doing it correctly, and the resolution of the math was going to happen when one of them found the variable the other hadn't accounted for. Conquest had known, coming into this, that Thragg's math was better over time. The longer this ran, the more Thragg's patience paid its accumulated dividend. His window was specific and finite. He had one advantage Thragg hadn't prepared for. He'd been learning. The prosthetic arm had been taking strikes for 8 minutes. Thragg had identified it early as the structural liability it appeared to be. The arm that was newer, the joint that was less integrated into Conquest's movement architecture. The side that responded fractionally slower than the flesh arm when he needed to defend from a right direction approach. He had been hitting it consistently, not targeting it to damage it, but to accumulate the micro-disruptions of repeated impact on a less stable system. The engineering in the arm was extraordinary. The GDA's 40% overbuilt elbow joint, the reinforced shoulder interface. But it was still a target Thragg had prioritized, because prioritizing structural weaknesses was what Thragg did. This was the variable Conquest had been preparing. He let Thragg reach for the arm. He had been inviting reaches toward it for the last 3 minutes without making the invitation visible. Small adjustments in his guard position, small gaps that opened and closed at the right intervals, to establish in Thragg's operational database that the prosthetic side was the exploitable one. Thragg reached for it not because he'd been manipulated in any obvious sense, but because the data supported reaching for it. Conquest turned the reach into a grip. Instead of pulling free, the expected response, the response Thragg had already prepared for, Conquest let Thragg close the hold on the prosthetic arm and then locked it. The prosthetic hand engaged the external surface of Thragg's grip, the mechanical joints closing around Thragg's hand with the force that the GDA's engineers had built into it. Not enough to restrain Thragg, nothing was enough to restrain Thragg. Enough to create mutual commitment, enough to make breaking the hold expensive for both of them. Thragg had the arm. Conquest had Thragg anchored. The flesh hand moved. 3 strikes, rapid succession, the full output that Conquest had been withholding across 8 minutes of forcing and absorbing, delivered from the inside angle that the anchor provided. The first hit Thragg's rib cage below the left arm. The second hit the same location, harder, with the angle adjusted 2 degrees to concentrate the force at the specific point where the first had already introduced stress. The third hit the same point again, with everything behind it. The sound the third strike produced was not the sound of armor failing or of dense Viltrumite tissue absorbing impact. It was the sound of something structural giving way. Thragg's ribs cracked. A stillness, 3 seconds approximately. Not a pause in combat. A genuine stop, both of them recognizing that something had just happened that required marking before anything else could follow. Thragg looked at his own torso, the specific, internal, physiological attention of someone taking stock of something their body has just reported. Then he looked at Conquest. For perhaps the first time in centuries, Conquest had no way to be certain. The opportunities for comparison were limited. Something had surprised Thragg, not destabilized him, not frightened him, but arrived in a category he hadn't expected to use. He had bled. Conquest held the 3 seconds. He looked at what he'd produced. This moment, this specific moment, was the one he had been building toward from the Nevada Basin floor, with one arm and dried blood on his face. Not the war, not the planet, not the alliance with Cecil and Nolan and the half-blood kid who kept getting up. This, watching Thragg process the fact that a strike had gotten through. It was enough to be this moment. Whatever came after, this had existed. It didn't last. Thragg's recalibration took less than 2 seconds and produced a fundamental shift in his approach. He had been fighting a control engagement, using his physical superiority as a framework within which Conquest's tactics were being managed and eventually resolved. He abandoned this. He shifted to attrition, the specific brutal logic of attrition. Stop managing the engagement and start simply accumulating Conquest's damage at a rate that exceeded Conquest's healing capacity. He started taking Conquest's strikes without positioning to minimize them. This was more frightening than the control engagement. A Thragg who was being tactical was a Thragg who was converting his advantage into a specific outcome. A Thragg who had decided to simply absorb and return was a Thragg who had done the math on both their healing rates and liked his answer. He was right to like it. Conquest knew he was right. He kept coming. He was not coming because he thought he could reverse the math. He was coming because every second he held Thragg's full attention here. On him, in this specific location, was a second Thragg, was not looking at the rest of the battle, was not assessing Mark, was not making the decisions that the Grand Regent made when the Grand Regent was thinking clearly and looking at the full operational picture. He was not staying in this fight to win it. He had known from the Nevada Basin what this fight was actually for. A hit that he couldn't redirect caught him across the chest. Thragg's right hand, full output, not the 60% of the opening exchange. He went down hard. Not the debris field this time. The hard pan itself, cratering under the impact, the Nevada Earth, doing what Earth does when something hits it with this kind of force. He got up. Thragg hit him again. He got up. Thragg paused. He was looking at Conquest the way you look at something when it's doing something you've seen before but haven't seen here. Something moved in his face, not recognition, not exactly, something adjacent to recognition. "You've been spending time with the half-breed," he said. Conquest was on both feet, upright, managing the inventory of what his body was currently processing. The chest from the first full output strike, 2 ribs from his own exchange, cracked in the commitment phase of the anchor sequence. The accumulated weight of 11 minutes of attrition against something whose ceiling he couldn't match. "You noticed," he said. "This isn't how you fight. You don't absorb punishment. You minimize it. This is his pattern." Thragg looked at him across the space between them, not with contempt, with the precise, evaluative attention of someone who has updated a threat model and is noting the implications. "You've been learning from a child. Maybe it's a better pattern." Thragg closed the distance. The strike he delivered went through Conquest's guard, not because the guard was wrong, but because Thragg's reach and power at full extension exceeded what a guard could be built to cover. It caught Conquest below the sternum at an angle that compressed and redirected and produced, in his internal structure, the specific catastrophic result that Thragg had been building toward for 3 minutes of attrition. Conquest's ability to remain upright ended. He went down, not to one knee, fully, the hard pan receiving him, the debris field around the engagement site taking the weight of 1,000 years of war finally running out of the road it had been traveling. Thragg stepped over him. He looked across the battlefield to where Mark Grayson was visible at distance, moving through the remaining formation elements. His operational assessment was already running. The Half-Blood's current state, the remaining Allied forces, the most efficient resolution of the engagement given the front line's failure. He began walking toward Mark. Behind him, Conquest's remaining hand pressed flat to the hard pan. He was running a different calculation. The hard pan was cold against his palm. Conquest registered this with the specific, calibrated attention of a body running a damage assessment. Not the cold as sensation, but the cold as information. The ground temperature, the ambient conditions, everything that was still functioning, catalogued in the first 2 seconds after going down. His internal architecture was reporting from multiple locations simultaneously. Each report assigned its priority rating the same way it had always been assigned. The same process that had been running since the first time a training session had put him on the ground at age 7, and he developed the habit of immediately knowing what he had left. Left arm, flesh arm, functional, full grip strength, full range of motion, nothing structural compromised. Right arm, prosthetic, operational. The anchor sequence had stressed the shoulder interface, but the interface had held. The engineers had overbuilt it. Ribs, existing crack from the exchange with Thragg, plus 2 new fracture sites from the attrition phase. Breathing was functional, but the specific quality of each breath was different from baseline. Not dangerous, expensive. Internal, the chest strike from Thragg's final approach had produced the thing that the previous 11 minutes had been building toward. Conquest knew what catastrophic internal damage felt like. He had felt it before, on campaigns, and had recovered from it. The question was always the same question. How much time? And toward what purpose? He ran the calculation. Thragg was 40 feet away and moving toward Mark. Mark was currently engaged with the last consolidated Viltrumite position on the eastern side of the basin, managing it, not overwhelmed, but working with full attention directed toward that engagement. He had not seen Thragg begin the approach. He would see him in approximately 15 seconds, which would give him enough time to orient and establish a defensive position, but not enough time to establish an advantageous one. And Thragg was not at his baseline. The cracked ribs from the anchor sequence were real. The attrition of the engagement had cost something. The accumulated 12 minutes of a fight against Conquest had produced a state that was not fully optimal, but it was close enough to fully optimal to make the physics of a sustained engagement between Thragg and Mark resolve in one direction. Mark had been trained to survive Viltrumites. He had not been trained to survive this specific Viltrumite, at this specific output level. The gap between those two things was the gap between what Conquest had been able to do in 35 days and what 35 years might eventually produce. He hadn't had 35 years. He'd had what he'd had. The calculation resolved. Conquest stood up. Thragg did not turn around. This was the tactical error, the only one he made, in a fight that had otherwise been executed with the precision of something that had been doing this at the highest possible level for longer than most civilizations lasted. He had assessed Conquest's damage state correctly. He had calculated correctly that the internal damage from the final sequence exceeded what Conquest's healing could address in the time frame of the ongoing engagement. He had turned away from a correctly calculated non-threat. The calculation had not accounted for the specific kind of not stopping that Conquest had been watching Mark do for 35 days, and that had lodged in him somewhere below the level of operational doctrine and above the level of instinct. He moved at full speed, not the controlled, efficient velocity of a tactical approach, full speed, the complete output of a body that had stopped managing its reserves because reserves were a concern for beings with a future to preserve them for. The approach covered the 40 feet in the interval between one moment and the next, and Conquest's arms went around Thragg from behind in the full clinch that was, by every standard of Viltrumite combat philosophy, the most non-Viltrumite technique available. Mutual vulnerability, both fighters on equal footing, the move of someone who has accepted the cost of what they're doing. The prosthetic arm went across Thragg's chest, pinning his dominant arm. The flesh arm wrapped the other side, completing the lock. Conquest's full grip engaged. The prosthetic hand's mechanical joints and the flesh hand's millennium of calibrated strength, combined into a single structural fact. Thragg's arms were contained. For approximately half a second, Thragg did not respond with the expected response. The unexpected nature of the technique, the non-Viltrumite technique, the one no warrior in the Empire's military history had used against the Grand Regent, because no warrior had been in the position of having nothing to lose by using it, required a recalibration that even Thragg's processing needed a fraction of a second to complete. Then Thragg responded. He drove backward. Conquest's back hit a standing section of concrete from the basin's edge. Not rubble, a full structural element, 3 feet thick, the remains of a retaining wall from some prior construction whose purpose the Nevada desert had forgotten. The concrete absorbed the impact and cracked through, and Conquest absorbed the rest, and held. Again, Thragg drove backward again, the same motion, more force. The cracked concrete gave way, they went through it, and landed in the rubble beyond it, and Thragg pivoted, trying to create the rotational force that would break the grip by changing the angle. Conquest held. His ribs were filing new reports. The reports were significant. He allocated them the appropriate priority, which was lower than the priority of the grip. Again, Thragg found a partial angle, not enough to break the clinch, but enough to drive an elbow backward into Conquest's compromised chest, at a trajectory that arrived at the existing damage from the previous strike. The pain produced was specific and categorical, and Conquest registered it and held. He could feel Thragg's processing running behind the physical response. The Grand Regent was doing what he always did, identifying the structure of the problem and finding the solution that removed it. The solution he was finding was the correct one. The only angle that was available to him from inside the clinch was forward and to the side, a strike that reached backward past his own body, committing his dominant arm to an internal trajectory. It was a technically difficult strike to execute. It was the only one that reached Conquest's torso from this position. It would also, in executing, move Thragg's dominant arm inside the space of the clinch. Inside the clinch, Thragg's guard opened. Conquest felt him set up the strike, felt the tension change in Thragg's body as the force gathered for it. He had two options: release the grip and absorb the position loss, or take the strike and stay locked, The grip had one more second of use in it. Maybe two. He stayed locked. Thragg's arm drove backward and into Conquest's chest at the angle that the confined geometry allowed. The impact was catastrophic in the specific way that Conquest had known it was going to be when he'd begun this approach. Something in his internal structure that had been compromised by the earlier damage received the full force of a Viltrumite strike, at close range without the benefit of any structural preparation. He held. His arms did not release. The sound he was making, not speech, not a combat vocalization, just the specific sound of a body continuing to function through something it had no remaining framework to process silently, was the loudest deliberate thing he had produced in 1,000 years. He turned his head. Mark was 20 feet away. He had cleared his engagement at some point in the last 30 seconds, had seen what was happening, had positioned, not frozen, not watching, but waiting, because some part of him had understood what was happening without being told, had read the geometry of the situation, and was holding the specific combat readiness of someone who is waiting for the right moment. Conquest looked at him. Grayson. His voice was not screaming. It was the loudest, most deliberate thing he had said in the story. Not performed volume, but the complete force of a being directing everything remaining into a single communication. Now. Mark did not hesitate. This was the fact. This was the complete fact of what 35 days had produced, and of what the 11 arguments about killing blows and permission and necessity had been building toward, and of what the specific and painful process of replacing a reflex with a choice had accomplished. He did not hesitate because the hesitation had been replaced, not with ruthlessness, but with decision. He had a choice. He made it. He came in at the vector that Conquest's position had made available, the specific approach angle that the clinch's geometry had created, the one that arrived at Thragg's guard while it was opened by the commitment of the backward strike, the window that existed for 2 seconds and would close when the strike's momentum resolved, and Thragg's arm came back. Full force. No 30% reduction. No negotiation at the moment of commitment. The complete uncalibrated output of a half-Viltrumite who had been trained for this specific moment by a being who understood, at a cellular level, what full commitment looked like and had spent 35 days refusing to accept anything less. The strike arrived at the point Conquest had identified during the preparation period. The physiological location that Conquest had mapped across 9 hours with the GDA's weapons engineers, the specific structural junction that Viltrumite durability protected through positional discipline, and that positional discipline, compromised by a clinch that held both arms engaged, left exposed. The cracked ribs from Conquest's earlier anchor sequence had already compromised the musculature Thragg needed for sustained flight. The targeted strike to that same region disrupted the structural and vestibular systems simultaneously, the accumulated damage resolving all at once into something his biology could not immediately override. The impact produced a sound, then silence, then both of them went down. The remaining armada broke within 4 minutes. It broke the way formations break when the authority that holds them together is removed, not through defeat, but through the dissolution of the organizing principle. The Viltrumite warriors in the air and on the ground registered what had happened with the combat intelligence of beings who processed battlefield information correctly, and what they processed was, Thragg was down. The Grand Regent, who had been the unifying fact of the Empire for as long as most of them had been warriors, was on the Nevada hardpan, and the engagement was no longer proceeding in any direction that their operational doctrine provided for. Some went up, some stopped fighting and hovered, some landed and stayed landed. Nolan moved through the dissolution with the specific authority of a Viltrumite warrior who had the cultural credibility to be heard by others in this state. Not commanding, not threatening, but present and speaking in the register that Viltrumite warriors responded to from another Viltrumite, the register of a peer who is telling you what the situation actually is. He spoke to the ones who had landed. He gave them the information and let them decide. Cecil's channel reported civilian corridor status clear. Infrastructure damage significant, manageable. Casualties being assessed. The Battle of Earth was over. Mark and Nolan reached Conquest at the same moment. He was on the ground in the space the engagement had made. The cracked hardpan, the rubble of the concrete section, the specific mess that a fight at this level produced in the terrain it moved through. The wound through his chest was not a thing that language made easier to describe, or that description changed the nature of. It was what it was. The biology that had been managing everything for the last 20 minutes was doing what it could with what it had, and what it had was no longer sufficient for the thing being asked of it. He was conscious. This was against any reasonable expectation. Against the expectations of his own damage assessment, which he was still running, because it was the process that didn't stop until everything else stopped. He was on his back, and he was conscious, and his remaining hand was pressed flat to the hardpan beside him. Not gripping, just present, just contact with the ground of a planet he had not chosen and had ended up defending, as the specific final fact of a very long chain of events. Mark knelt beside him. He didn't have anything ready to say. He'd learned, across 35 days of a training relationship that communicated primarily through silence and physical correction, that having things ready to say was a habit that this particular dynamic had never rewarded. He knelt, and he was there, and he was present, and that was what he had. Nolan put his hand on Conquest's shoulder. Not a grip. Contact. Conquest looked at the space above him, where the Nevada sky was beginning to show the specific quality of morning that came after something definitive had happened. Not different from other mornings, just ordinary in a way that felt remarkable at this specific moment. He was looking through it at nothing in particular. His breathing changed, then steadied, then changed again. His hand, pressed flat to the hardpan, was still. Mark didn't move for a long time. He stayed kneeling on the hardpan beside Conquest's body, while the Nevada morning completed its arrival, the light going from the preliminary gray of almost dawn to the flat, specific brightness of a desert day that had no opinion about what had happened in the dark before it. Around him, the basin was doing what battlefields do when the fighting stops, settling into its new geography, the craters and rubble and scorched ground becoming simply the terrain now, the way all terrain is simply the terrain until you know what made it. The GDA medical team arrived, and assessed and did what medical teams do when they arrive at a situation that has moved past their operational category. They were professional about it. Conquest would not have wanted anything less. Nolan stayed. He stood a few feet back from Mark and didn't speak, which was correct. He understood, with the specific knowledge of someone who had known Conquest for centuries and had watched what the last 35 days had built, that there was nothing to say that was equal to what had just happened, and that attempting to find something would be the wrong choice. After a while, Mark stood up. He looked at the sky, the real sky, the ordinary Nevada sky of a morning that was proceeding without particular comment on the events below it. He looked at it for a long time. Then he turned and walked toward the facility, and Nolan walked beside him, and neither of them spoke until they were underground. The resolution of the Armada took 3 days. Nolan handled the Viltrumite warriors who had landed and stopped fighting. He moved through them with the cultural authority of a senior warrior speaking to others in the register. They understood, delivering the information that the situation required. Thragg was alive but incapacitated. The recovery timeline ran to months, and the operational capacity during that recovery ran to 0. The Grand Regent was not available to issue orders. The commission that had brought them here was no longer executable in any form that their doctrine provided for. Most of them went, not in defeat. Viltrumites did not process departure the way defeated forces processed it. They left because the operational logic had resolved into a state their mandate didn't cover, and a warrior without a mandate was a warrior between assignments. Some of them, the oldest ones, the ones who had been in the Empire long enough to have developed opinions about it, stayed long enough to talk to Nolan. Not many. Enough. Anissa was released from containment on day 3. Cecil delivered the terms directly. Leave, report that Earth was defended and costly, and include in that report the information that the cost included conquest. He wanted Thragg to know that. He had specific reasons for wanting Thragg to know that, which he kept in the category of things he had decided and didn't need to discuss with anyone. She looked at Cecil for a moment. Then she went. Cecil watched her go and went back to his desk and opened his operational file on the engagement and began the damage assessment that would occupy his team for months. Earth's infrastructure losses were significant. The casualty figures were what they were. The repair process was beginning. On the last page of his initial assessment, under a section heading that read, Assets Lost, he wrote one line. He sat with it for a moment. He moved on. Thragg was transported to a containment facility whose location Cecil kept at the highest available security classification, and whose existence he disclosed to exactly 3 people, all of whom were already involved in the construction. The facility was designed around one specific occupant and over-engineered to a degree that Cecil's budget office flagged, and Cecil approved anyway. He noted in the facility's operational charter that the containment was indefinite and that any review of that status required his direct authorization. He filed the charter and moved on to the next item. The intelligence that Conquest had produced during his time in the facility did not die with him. Cecil's team spent 6 weeks processing the complete materials, the tactical documentation, the physiological vulnerability assessments, the invasion doctrine analysis, the detailed profiles of the Armada's composition. It was more comprehensive than anything the GDA had produced about Viltrumite military structure in its entire operational history. It had been compiled without being asked for, across weeks of recovery and training, by a being who had apparently decided that making the knowledge useful was a form of completion. The materials were classified at the highest available level and distributed to a list of recipients that Cecil curated personally. He added a cover note that described the source as a GDA asset of significant operational value and included no further attribution. He knew that wasn't enough. He filed it anyway. 6 months later, on a Tuesday afternoon in Washington, D.C., a monument was dedicated on the grounds of GDA headquarters. It was not large. Conquest would have found large monuments absurd. Cecil had understood this about him in the way you understood things about a being you'd observed closely for months, and the monument's scale reflected that understanding without making it explicit. It was a standing figure, bronze, larger than human scale, one-arm prosthetic, head lifted at an angle that was directed toward the sky without being performed about it. The figure looked like something that had made a decision and was in the middle of acting on it. The sculptor had gotten this right without being told to. Cecil gave the dedication address. It ran to 4 minutes. He called Conquest an asset of incalculable value to Earth's continued security and a being whose knowledge and capability proved decisive in the defense of this planet. He used the word chose once in a sentence about operational commitment and moved on before it could be dwelt on. He was good at this. He had been doing it for decades. Mark stood in the crowd and listened. He heard the words Cecil said, and he heard the shape around the words, the shape of what Cecil had decided not to say in a public address, which was in some ways the more complete accounting. When the ceremony dispersed, he stayed. He stood in front of the statue on a Tuesday afternoon in no particular weather and looked at it. Not at the face. The sculptural face was an approximation, and he found approximations of things he knew well, somewhat harder to look at than the absence of them. He looked at the arm, the prosthetic one rendered in bronze, the elbow joint slightly overbuilt in a way that the sculptor had included from the specifications he'd been given and that was accurate in the specific technical sense that mattered to the engineers, who had built the original. He looked at it for a long time. Cecil came up from behind. He stopped beside Mark and looked at the statue, and they stood together in the way of two people who are not comfortable with each other and have arrived, through the specific gravity of a shared experience, at a place adjacent to comfort. He never stopped being dangerous, Mark said. No, Cecil said. I don't think he ever stopped being what he was. No, I don't think he did either. Mark looked at the prosthetic arm in the bronze, at the upward angle of the head, at the figure's posture, which the sculptor had rendered with the specific quality of something that had made its calculation and was done with the making of it, but he was here, when it mattered. He chose to be here. Cecil was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the particular flatness of a man delivering an assessment he has considered carefully and has decided is correct. That might be the most dangerous thing he ever did. He walked away. His footsteps receded across the flagstone and were absorbed into the ordinary noise of the city around them. Mark stayed. He looked at the statue for another few minutes. He thought about a Nevada training floor at 0547, arrived at before anyone told him to arrive early. He thought about a steel rod bent back straight and placed in the equipment rack instead of the disposal pile. He thought about a rock shelf at night and a 1,000-year-old warrior saying, in the specific flat register of someone stating a fact they had not intended to arrive at, the one that has something worth losing. He thought about 2 syllables delivered from the floor of a Nevada basin with every available resource directed at their production. Now. He had not hesitated. He looked up from the statue at the sky above Washington, D.C., the same sky that was above the Nevada basin on the night Conquest had stood on the rock shelf and watched the stars and said the thing he'd said. The same sky that was above the training floor and the GDA facility, and the 6 months of work that had preceded a Tuesday afternoon in no particular weather. The sky had no position on any of this. It was sky. It continued. Mark stood under it for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked back toward the city, which was doing what cities did, moving, functioning, ongoing. The ordinary life of a planet that existed because of 1,000 choices made by beings who hadn't always understood their own reasons. He had training to get back to. He had work to do. The statue stood behind him on its flagstone, bronze and still, the prosthetic arm catching the afternoon light in the specific way that engineered metal catches light, without warmth, without softness, but accurately. It was enough. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.